Hello and welcome to the Franchise Territory Mapping Summit. My name is Lawrence, I'm the head of marketing here at MangoMap. And just to give you some background, MangoMap is the leading franchise sales and territory mapping platform, helping brands all across the globe create and sell more franchise territories, normally within 90 days of deployment. Throughout the course of the day, we will be taking you through step by step how you can switch to a territory-driven strategy, how you can use demographic data to create really awesome territories and then present to prospective franchisees to ultimately get them to buy in. I'm joined here today by Paul from MangoMap, our resident franchise mapping expert. I think we can probably start with an introduction, Paul, and just if anyone hasn't watched the previous videos, they can just get an idea of what you do at MangoMap and the type of clients that you work with.
Thanks, Lawrence. So really my role at MangoMap is to work with people to understand, what they want to achieve in terms of territory mapping, where they are right now, where they want to be, and then to sit down and go through and figure out what an ideal territory looks like, then to bring in the data that's required to make that happen, bring in the boundary data, put it all together to produce compelling territories that they can then take and present to their prospects and their candidates. So it's really that whole journey from sort of conceptualization to final delivery, presentation, and sale of that business.
You mentioned it there about boundary data, and that's actually the topic of today's talk. We've covered in previous talks about why territories and also about demographic data. But the next step in the step-by-step process, if you will, is putting it together in a boundary, joining that demographic data to a boundary so that you actually have a territory on a map that you can then go and sell to prospective franchisees. So I think let's start with a brief description and about boundary data, what it is, what the different types are, and how you go about joining that to say demographic data.
Yeah, sure. So as we mentioned in the previous talk, census data is a household level survey, but you can't get access to the household level data because for privacy reasons mostly. So the data is disseminated for areas, and these areas have a boundary. And that's a group of people who live in that area, or they might work in the area, depending on which data you're looking at. And it's a summary of everything that's going on inside there. And so there are normally various levels of boundary types that are disseminated by the census offices in various countries. And let me just go through those briefly. So the two main types are postal codes and statistical areas. So they have different pros and cons, which we'll go through in a minute, but that's one of the things to think about when launching into a territory mapping exercise is what's the appropriate boundary type for me to work with that's going to have demographic data attached.
Yeah. So you can think of boundary data then as they're predefined boundaries, but they're also, in terms of like a territory mapping approach, they're the building blocks. You can join different ones together to make a larger territory, but they're the basic units in order to start building territories, right?
Yeah, that's right. So in most scenarios, you wouldn't just assign a single area to a territory, a single zip code. There would normally be a number of areas that can be grouped together to form that territory. So let's say your target is 50,000 people in an area. You might have a zip code with 10,000, 10,000, 15,000. So you just aggregate them together across those units and start to build your territories up.
I suppose that's where the strategy that we talked about last time comes in, because the amount of people that you say want in a territory, it really differs from brand to brand. So it's building your business case and then looking at the demographics, and then it's packaging it into a territory using the building blocks of the statistical areas or the zip or postal code. So if we look to say postal codes, for example, or zip codes, what are some of the pros and cons of that? Because like you said, there's different building blocks and certain brands take different approaches. So I think let's start with zip and postal codes and let's look at the pros and cons.
So zip codes or postal codes, depending on which country you're in, they are a convenient geographic unit to use, a convenient boundary type. They are well known to people. If you give someone a postcode and they're from that place, they'll generally know where it is. Often digital or physical marketing campaigns can be tied to those zip codes, those postal areas. So in that sense, it's an easy unit to work with. There are a couple of drawbacks. The main one being is that they are not an administrative area. So the boundaries themselves are not drawn by the Postal Service because they have no interest in drawing them. Their business is delivering mail to physical addresses. So a zip code is actually a collection of delivery routes. And so various organizations draw approximate boundaries around them. And the US Census Bureau, for example, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they'll make very clear that the boundaries that they disseminate are similar to postcode areas, but they're not identical. So in the US, they call them zip code tabulation areas, and in Australia, they're called postcode areas to differentiate them from the postcodes themselves. Now, that's not necessarily a big deal because the data within them is still accurate. That has come from real household data. But you do need to be a little bit careful if you're thinking about boundaries because there is no legal cross-agency agreement about where that boundary is. So once you've selected that boundary type, you really have to stick with it and just be careful how you use it. The other slight drawback of zip codes is they're often quite large. And so if your territory size target is maybe 20 or 30,000 people, and you've got zip codes that are 40, 50,000 people, they're too large for a single territory. And if you group two together, it's just going to be a bit awkward, and you're not really going to achieve a desired result in terms of getting the size right, getting the shape right, and often the boundaries can be just a little bit jagged. So with that in mind, I wouldn't say don't use zip codes, but there are some considerations to be taken into account there.
One really important one is that they're also not uniformly sized, correct? So there's no uniform size by population. So sometimes a very dense area could be smaller, for example, and then a less dense area could be slightly larger. Maybe explore that a little bit.
That's definitely the case, and often. Different parts of the city will develop, more people will move into a place, and suddenly that zip code becomes, has a very high population. That's in quite a contrast to the other boundary type, which are statistical areas. In the US, they call tracts, census tracts. And the main difference is that the tracts are primarily designed to group a particular number of households or individuals together. So let's say a tract has a target of, say, 5,000 people. So that makes them sort of uniformly sized in terms of, a territory mapping exercise, which makes them ideal for grouping them together to get your shape and size targets met. They also typically follow roads and natural features like rivers and things like that much better. So it's a much cleaner boundary. And they're often available at different levels. So you might have a lower level statistical area, so sort of micro areas, if you will, which are good if you want to look at what's happening, say, around a particular location in, very high detail, let's say within 1 kilometre. Or you can choose a sort of a mid-level statistical area that are just going to be quicker to work with, but it still, provide the convenience of uniform sizing. So I would say that there's no right answer here about whether zip codes or statistical areas are the better choice. There's pros and cons of each.
Yeah, go through the cons of statistical areas a little bit, because we touched on the benefits there. I know that, for example, there's no identifier for a statistical area. So
yeah, that's right. They often have IDs that are just some really long random number. They're meaningless to people. So it really comes down to just that visual boundary. They also don't tie that well into either digital or physical marketing campaigns because there's no specific place associated with those statistical areas. There'll be some overlap with zip codes, but it won't be perfect. And so if you are sort of very zip code or postcode driven as a business in terms of how you assign leads, how your franchisees market, that might not be the ideal choice to use statistical areas.
The third option is counties, right? So we haven't touched on that yet. So maybe explain a little bit about the pros and cons of counties as well, because there's zip codes, there's statistical areas, and there's also, a higher level county approach that some brands use.
So these are, local government administrative units. In the US and the UK, they're called counties. In the UK, local government areas. And so this is a unit of government administration. They are also well known, so they can be useful. And in places, say the Midwest in the US, where the populations are relatively low, it can be a good basis to use counties to form territories. Some counties only have 20, 30,000 people living in them. But in the cities, say in Los Angeles or Phoenix, Maricopa County, these are extremely large counties. The single county has more than 1 million people living in it, and so that's not ideal for that city context. So I would say sometimes they're useful, but sometimes they do fall short, and so that needs to be borne in mind.
Well, this is always a key consideration when you are discussing with franchise brands, which you do a lot of. So walk me through how you would, for example, choose the right boundary type, some of the questions you might ask to determine that for a specific franchise.
The main parameters to think about is territory size. So if they're on the smaller side, then tracts are probably preferable. If they tend to be mid or larger size, say 50,000 and up, 50,000, 100,000, then the zip codes are certainly possible. The other consideration would be is if you're doing zip code-based marketing. So if that's really important to your business to know exactly which zip codes are in an area, then you tend to favor a zip code building block for your territories, despite the drawbacks. So there's no right answer here, as I mentioned, but you do really need to pick one or the other at the beginning and then move forward with that strategy. But certainly we have a lot of experience in this area. We can help to guide people to make the right choice.
It sounds like it's somewhat of a big choice, because if you make that initial decision, then you sort of have to stay consistent with that, particularly if you sell a few franchises and then you think, I want to switch strategy. It can be somewhat difficult. Right?
Yeah, it's possible to switch, but there's some complications there because there'll be overlap between or gaps if you switch to another strategy. It's possible to deal with that, but of course, it's better to avoid it in the first place.
We've discussed the different boundary types that we can use. I mean, they've been predefined. There's statistical areas, there's zip or postal codes, there's counties, and they all have their pros and cons, and they all map to a specific client need, I imagine, and that will come out during the early negotiations, exactly what you're looking for, what your priorities are, what your budget is, all of these type of things. So we've discussed boundary types, and I think people, at its very core, a territory is a shape on a map, which is the boundary, it's the geographical unit. And then the data that is within that, and then you just join the two together. So there are a million different ways that you can do that. And obviously that it's really determined by your specific business needs, and you can't just transplant one strategy from one company into another. It needs to have some thought behind it. So we're going to be covering this a lot in the next talk, which is putting it all together. Like, how do you take that geographic unit and tie it to all of the demographic data that you've thought about and determined? Maybe just give us a quick walkthrough of how you would put that together, and then we can delve deeper into that in the next video.
The basic idea is to really pick your sort of key parameters. So is it just a total population count? Is it a count of people within a particular income bracket? And then also to exclude certain areas. So obviously we want to exclude low population areas and just focus on where there's a higher density of people living. You may or may not exclude areas based on income if you don't think that service or offering is going to have a good response in those areas. And then it's just basically a question of working with those primary indicators, either population or count by income bracket, and building up to you until you reach your target size for a territory. The other thing is of course, shape. And we're talking about a map and geographic areas. But really, what it comes down to is, how do people move around in a city? If you've got a long, thin territory, they're not going to drive end to end to get to that service. Ideally, they should be relatively compact in size. Somebody's going to use or drive or walk to get that service. So it's got to be convenient to them. Obviously, the site will be somewhere within there. But the size and the shape are really the main things that we're thinking about in that process.
And also, I'd like a downstream effect of this is you can estimate how many units, say, a city or a region will support. So it helps with business planning as well, I imagine.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of people do have a clear idea about that when they're starting out. And so that's sort of one of the parameters that guide, particularly in thinking about sizing. So if you think, okay, this city can probably support 30 to 40 units. What does that mean in terms of territory size? And then you can sort of go back and forth until you think you've got the balance right, and then start using that as in your building strategy or your building process. But yeah, that overall count is an important number to keep in mind.
Okay, so we've done like a broad look at this in terms of zip codes or postal codes, looking very high level at this. I think let's distill this down now so that we can do a specific country example. So I think let's look at the United States and see how a boundary data, say strategy or a territory creation process, when it comes to the boundary, and would work in the United States.
So in the United States, the two main boundary types that we see people working with and that we recommend that they consider, one is the zip code, and there are about 40,000 zip codes in the United States. So they're ideal if your territories are a little bit larger, let's say in the range 50 to 100,000 people and up, and or you're wanting to do digital marketing or physical marketing that are very much based on zip codes. And you might accept that maybe some territories will be a little bit smaller or a little bit larger than the average, but you're willing to accept that in the context of having the benefits of well-known places that can be marketed to. So that's the first main boundary type that we see people using. And as we mentioned earlier, you've got to be a little bit careful because those boundaries are not official in any sense. Once you've selected them, of course, they are permanent, they're visible, they're real. So you can work with them going forward. But if you got data from a different source, the boundary might be drawn slightly differently. And that's in contrast to the second main boundary type that we see people using in the United States, which are census tracts. And so census tracts are really designed to encompass a certain number of people. I think there are about 70,000 census tracts in the United States. So it gives you a little more sort of finer control about the size and the shape of your territories. They just have an ID that's a 6 or an 8-digit number that doesn't really mean anything. So once they're prepared, it really just comes down to that visible boundary. The data within it, of course, is absolutely correct because it's disseminated by the Census Bureau for those tracts, the same with the zip codes. But if your territories are a little smaller, let's say in the range of 20,000 to 30,000, and you're not so worried about, say, digital marketing, then census tracts might be the better choice. And in fact, you can go one level more detailed than a census tract. It's called a block group. But there are literally millions of them in the United States. So it's a little bit rarer to see that. You'd have to have sort of a hyper-local offering, I think, or you really want to know what's going on at the block level in a city. But certainly it's possible, and data is available for block groups in the United States.
Let's just reiterate that point. So when the census or the survey community data is released, they are released at all of these different levels, right?
That's right.
It's very easy to... Well, not easy, but it's all available.
Yeah, that's right. It's all available at all of those levels, state, county, zip code, tract, and subblock, a block group, I should say. So it's really up to you to make the right choice and give a bit of thought to it up front before you dive in.
So I think the summary there is that there's all the data is available. There's different areas.
Right.
So this is something that we have to work with clients quite closely on because it is somewhat overwhelming because there is so much choice. And it's like, how do you zero in on a strategy that is going to help your business grow the best? So that's where I imagine, that's where you work quite closely with our clients, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, so I think that really does cover boundary data in detail. We've gone from Y territories. In the previous video, we touched on demographic data, and now we're talking about the actual shape and size of the territory in terms of geographics. It's taking that geographic boundary and blending it with the data, and that's the real art of territory creation. In the next video, we're going to be showing you, doing a real deep dive about how you put it all together and really deliver territories and be able to map them that you can then present to your franchisees in order to really sell the business opportunity, to really bring it to life in terms of, okay, what is the local opportunity here? How many people are there? What's the income? So that they have everything that they need in order to make that informed decision. So the next talk is going to be about putting it all together. And then after that, we'll be touching upon the sales process. So I hope that was informative. Thank you for joining me, Paul. I'll see you in the next video. And to everyone watching, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
Thank you, Lawrence.